Hello everyone, today we talk about the decline of the Roman military administration and the establishment of the Germanic one in the lands of the Western Roman Empire. It's a topic that, as you know, we have already addressed. There is a pretty hefty migration era playlist at this point that contains already something about that. Today we will speak essentially of two things specifically. The first one will try to give like a stereotypical picture of what happened mostly in the least Romanized areas of the Western Roman Empire at the arrival of the settlement of the Germanic populations, right? And what we can speak even of an average, right? What happened in these territories in terms of the changes in the military administration, right? Properly the military systems. And the other one being instead the counter argument, or better, not really in oppositional terms, but still the observation that certain lands of the empire, especially the Mediterranean ones, didn't actually transition so quickly from let's say a model to another, right? There was obviously, today we will talk pretty much about the blending of the whole thing, right? And we will speak specifically of Ostrogothic Italy under Theodoric, right? That is possibly the best example, not just of permanence, in fact, the Roman military administration, but also of the most successful example of integration between Romans and Germans in the world migration era, right? And we made a video about the Ostrogoths. We discussed a lot also Visigothic Spain, where something similar actually happened, like in southern France, in the Iberian Peninsula, broadly meant even under the Burgundians, for example, at a certain level. And there is some other video we made, for example, about the settlement of the various Germanic peoples in these various western lands, from Anglo-Saxon England to Ostrogothic and Longobard Italy, passing through, of course, Merovingian Gaul and Visigothic Spain, drawing some differences that objectively existed. Certain similarities too, technically. Gaul and Spain were much more similar than Britain and, or better, Anglo-Saxon England and Longobard Italy, right? This is very interesting because even very far away lands actually were sometimes more similar in the process of Germanization, however, in the relation between Romans and Germans that we will observe today than closer ones. Our objective today is essentially to start explaining, or to introduce properly, because we will have to make actually a lot of videos about the specific points we will make as a sort of synthesis. Now, to the permanence, the continuation, right, in the transformation of the Roman military administration into the Romano-Germanic kingdoms proper. As you know, today, at certain levels, we like mostly to stress the continuity of late antiquity, especially in certain areas of Europe, mostly in southern Europe, where in northern Europe, stressing the break. That sometimes was very traumatic, right? Lands, for example, in Britain, it was very traumatic. In Italy, in part, at certain points, was very traumatic. That's also why these two lands were actually similar. In Gaul and in Spain, this didn't quite happen, right? In Gaul and Spain was a great continuity, right? Especially, naturally, the most Romanized of the respective areas, right? But properly, the Frankish and Visigothic kingdoms were founded on specific premises that were very, very similar, after all, to each other. So, the migration era, as you know, is a complex time, not just because of it's very long, lots of things happen, but properly because there were different superimpositions, right? Different ways of peoples. They all had actually a specific character, right? The Franks were not the Ostrogoths. The Alemanni were not the Visigoths. The Anglo-Saxons were not the Burgundians. There was a lot going on, specifically in the differences that we're trying to draw usually in winter, by Christmas holidays, I make a couple of videos about specific Germanic peoples and trying to explain better their differences. Last year was about the Goths. We made something before about the Burgundians, the Vandals, and the Alemanni, but those were old videos, so maybe we will do something else. For this year, I plan chiefly, properly the peoples of Germany, like the Thuringia and Saxony. They're quite interesting because these peoples didn't quite move from where they were, but they also had their own specific characters. So we will observe this in a broader paradigm that, however, we have never to forget that it's not that the empire ever ended. Not even in the West. Not just because, of course, of the Justinian reconquest that, of course, made Byzantine avantposts remaining and not just avantposts, but entire chunks, entire provinces remaining in the West, chiefly in Italy, but before the Islamic invasions also in Spain. Or better, actually, before, at the time the Islamic invasion, the Visigoths had already absorbed the last Roman remnants. But there are interesting aspects of the persistence, for example, of northern African principalities that were actually thinking of being there for Rome, right? And this is something we'll also see today, looking at the mandate that fundamentally the Germanic peoples had in the West, so that, of course, we don't have to exceed believing that, as some likes to stress also for didactic purposes. Sometimes I've done it myself, and in part it is definitely true. I mean, the fact that these various Germanic populations actually were quite concerned about what the empire would do next, and they were fundamentally reverent about the imperial authority, so that they would always try to settle in the formerly inhabited lands of the empire that technically were conceived by the Romans always as such, right? In the name on behalf of the Roman of the empire, right? And this is quite important because it had a deep legacy in the history of early medieval Europe and beyond, right? One could quote easily the Carolingian Empire in terms of the revival of Roman power, ideally, constructed at the point between the papacy and the Franks. Eventually the attempts of Renovatio Imperii that went on after, but properly in the early medieval times, actually the Roman legacy in all of these countries, up to Anglo-Saxon England, you find maybe fairly late in time, at some point by the 9th century, if I'm not wrong, you find Anglo-Saxon kings styling themselves as Basileus, right? Not even imperator, right, like in Latin, but properly the Greek term that at that point was used in Constantinople. And that's actually quite interesting, because it, you wouldn't think about it. I know this thanks to one of my colleagues that made a PhD about that, right? And we were all amazed, because objectively it's a very important thing, but also Visigothic Spain, we've seen it, before the Islamic invasions, in spite of all the problems that objectively the kingdom had in its unity, in its maintaining, but it was developing something extremely interesting in terms of imperial ideology. The councils of Toledo had taken over Visigothic policy, let's say, also in styling the ones that happened in Constantinople. As you know, Visigothic Spain was deeply Romanized, but aside from this, what we care today is specifically about the military administration. That is to say, what is that properly remained of the Roman, not of the Roman army, which is also a very interesting and fascinating topic. There were actually units in all of Western Europe that remained, right? Roman units, of course, that belonged to the Roman army proper back in the day, that remained settled as regiments, as their own, with their own identity and esprit de corps for even under the Germanic kings, right? And that helped also to develop locally a military system that the Germans had never quite used because it was functional to a fully sedentarized society with a urbanized area with very different political and social systems that were much more unitary that also the Germans had ever seen. Other lands we'll see today were more deeply Germanized at the point that you can't even properly distinguish the persistence of a Roman influence, but you still can guess it at certain levels because the two things got blended together easily, right? There's not a single place in Europe that didn't receive. Even those lands had never properly been controlled by the Roman Empire, didn't receive, it wasn't Romanized. And especially in the political and hence in military models that are very important. So you understand there is really a lot to say about this because this is, and that explains why this is just an introduction, right? Because we will have to make a video for each one of these countries specifically, and also observing what the relics, the remains of the Roman army were in these areas. That's a quite fast, very obscure history, unfortunately, from a documentary point of view, but from what we know, there's really nothing surprising about it. And of course, the first dichotomy we have to get rid of here is that there was properly an opposition between the Romans and the Germans proper. Right, there was a distinction, was even a discrimination, but there was not a positive dialectic in terms of what eventually, in fact, the Romano-Germanic kingdoms had to become, right? And we're talking about entities that in many ways, also because of pre-existing, even pre-Roman history, of course, had their own specific characters that sometimes are, close to the ones of modern Europe, like these areas we'll see now is essentially, Gaul broadly meant. Could easily see France, Spain, Italy, the UK. It's a broad statement, but you understand it's very, it's a very approximate concept in here. But objectively, there is here the main problem making these societies work in a way that couldn't go back to the tribal model. It didn't go back, in fact. Right, it was rather the tribal model that was enhanced in many areas and towards a more unitary system that model proper that was a legacy of the Roman one. This naturally happened through Romanization chiefly because, if anything, from a bureaucratic administrative point of view, how do you manage this all? If you're even illiterate, or if you have to, we're talking about huge areas. Like, if you think about what the Merovingians ruled, it was something enormous, right? It's a territory that required necessarily the support of the local Roman administration to be governed. There is also another issue, though, that of course we can see a continuity in this, but there is probably a moment of greater synthesis that occurs by my opinion, especially starts to be more evident from the second half of the 6th century. The 7th is usually considered the moment of apex of this. That is properly a contraction of the whole system everywhere, right? It's due to many factors that here we don't have nor the time nor the objective to explain. We explain elsewhere. But objectively, that's when many pre-existing aspects of this broader latent reality really come to be transformed at the roots, right? So it transitions in something that historically we think of something else, right? It's not even a useful way of didactically speaking of telling it, but indeed there is at some point the idea of a world that deeply contracts. And incidentally, we will see tomorrow why, because today, tomorrow we'll talk specifically about Pierre's thesis, right, and the role also of the Islamic invasions in this. That is very controversial because even in here in different areas actually had very different impacts, and that generally speaking is probably to be much more deeply researched at this point, because we realized that what happened also afterwards was crucial for the eventual development of Europe at different levels. Another thing that is very important to stress is also that depending on your country of origin, surely you had different impressions of this period in a way or another, right? Northern, Southern Europe, Germanic or Romance countries, and also simply different later histories that influence for different national reasons, either highlighted one legacy or another, and having certain attitudes that really have nothing to do with this period, but inform the way you look at that period. Generally speaking, I think that because of the prevalence of Anglo-Saxon culture in the world in the last century, we tend to see most of medieval history at a popular level, also thanks to banally to movies, to video games, where objectively emerge mostly from the Anglosphere. Let's say the darker side of the story, because objectively in Britain, as I said before, the period was harder than in other regions of Europe. So this idea of the trauma of the break, right? Today we will not talk much about Anglo-Saxon England, but not even properly, because the Great Break was even before actually the Anglo-Saxon migration, right? It was a Romano-Brittonic story, right? And so in there, the idea that there are dramatically less sources, it's a very particular area. It was a fringe of the empire. It was and there were very different dynamics to much more intensely Roman, as the rest of Western Europe generally was, right? We should add North Africa, by the way, because North Africa also was actually pretty damn developed at the time, and even the Vandal occupation wasn't anything particularly traumatic as it's being written. But of course, in the West we have today we know these things, of course, but in the West we still have this idea that any way you read it, it's been something dramatic, right? And there were many other periods of change, of transition, historically speaking, but to this one we attach a serious stigma in a way or another, right? And this is also to be dispelled as long as you understand, of course, even the graduality of all these phenomena. This video is also aimed naturally at presenting a minimal base to the phenomenon, how the very complex one of how the passage from a Roman to a Germanic military administration occurred, so also for the sake of record made certain cultural and anthropological aspects. A first step to taking here is observing at the fact that, generally speaking, the Romano-Germanic monarchies didn't have at their disposal regular armies, properly troops, right, salaried by a central administration as a permanent army, essentially. So even in here, the differences, as we will see, are more leveled than what it seems compared to late antique times. But in general, we can say that the bureaucracy that served the Romano-Germanic kingdoms became quite soon rudimentary in many aspects. It saw the diminution in large part of its means and especially range of action, right? This also from a geographical point of view is important to realize that there were more immediate needs also at the local level, and this reality is felt the need to basically enclose something. This is what happened also in Roman society before the migration era at many levels. Think about just the fragmentation of the empire during the 3rd century corresponded still to the idea, okay, we all deal with this local business of the province that fundamentally had always remained entrusted to a decentralized government in a way or another. Eventually, the Constantinian, the Diocletian and the Constantinian empires, made this great effort to control more directly the territory, but also it mostly controlled the means through which the control could be exercised, or better, the stability of the government in other ways. And this has to do naturally with taxations, because at this time, for example, direct taxes definitely regressed notably, right? It was very difficult to control the various communities, to appreciate their wealth, their potential in many ways, and to, in the first place, try to exercise a rigid control, a rigid authority on it. In certain areas, direct taxation basically disappears. Usually, Romano-Germanic kingdoms have a much lower fiscal pressure compared to the Byzantine Empire, right? In perspective for those time standards, and this also produces interesting phenomena at a cultural level, including lots of people that were Romans easily, that actually fled the empire, the imperially controlled territory, to actually go live into the Germanic ruled areas. Indirect taxation decreases together with trade exchange, right? Tomorrow we'll see that much better because of Piran's thesis, according to whom, as long as the empire was around, the Arabs didn't come, trade went on as in the ancient times. This is not true. There had been a brusque contraction of exchanges, and actually Islamic invasions opened a lot of markets on a much broader area than any other empire had existed in the Middle East, in Mediterranean, up to that point from that side, and even helped to revive trade, which never, of course, came to an end, but in certain areas of Europe, went down, especially in the north, essentially because of the, local, poorer disposability. In southern Europe, this was much less evident at many levels, and there is to consider many communities that were probably not under the direct control of the Roman Empire still felt as if they were, or at least they searched for legitimization by Constantinople, and there was still this thought that technically the Romans could come back, right, after the Islamic invasions that brusquely resized the Byzantine Empire. Of course, this came to be less likely, and that's also a process, in fact, that increased the detachment of the West from the East. That was a big deal, and that, however, wasn't something that happened just because of this phenomenon, because the same Roman Empire had, culturally speaking, many differences that were especially in this space. Since the very beginning, by the way. So this thing of trade is also all to explore in many ways, because archaeology, especially submarine archaeology, is kind of very expensive, as you know. So there's not a dramatic process, but there is plenty of stuff still to read and to understand, right? So another colleague of mine studied something beautiful. I think it was in the Roman countryside in the early Middle Ages. You would think that mostly we would know what happened, like in early medieval Europe, in certain areas, especially this substantial development in those centuries. History is all to be written, right? There were entire cities at the time that went on without also much of an apparent contraction throughout all those centuries that simply nobody has dug to study, to find. There is an enormous set of information that are hidden, buried, and are there yet to be discovered. And unfortunately, since archaeology, mostly for reasons that are mainly economical and connected to this broader sensationalism, etc., mostly digs for classical stuff, right? The ancient Romans and Greeks, that's what they think. Nobody cares much about early medieval times that are instead being stigmatized historically as this dark ages that weren't, right, except maybe extremely few areas of Europe properly meant, and mostly from a documentary point of view. So that it's as if in the West we wanted to forget an era that wasn't dark at all, right, and that we just stigmatized for ideological reasons. This is a very important aspect of the story. However, indeed, the contraction had happened, right? In certain areas, especially, as we've seen, more than others. So currency circulated less. The phenomenon of treasuring multiplied. What happened is, of course, because of all this political instability, lots of people had to flee their houses, and instead of bringing together all their precious metal, they buried it somewhere, right? This gave rise to an enormous set of legions and stories, anecdotes, and so on, and it had connected with the broader passage from paganism to Christianity. This also Chthonic, Telluric, opposed to the Polynic, a heavenly idea of the various symbologies and exoteric aspects of it. It was already perceived at the time that this world that had been coldening and losing consistency in some way had been a great thing, and that people still believed in the magic of it and in the power of these forces. And thinking about Arthur, think about this idea of also this new cultures had brought from the East and had revived, let's say better, this chivalric military idea of sacred weaponry, of powers coming directly from the divinity. So all these factors, to make the long story short, contributed to make the resources of the Romano-Germanic monarchies to be absorbed in large measure by the immediate private expenses of the king and their retinues, right, their followers. This is very important. There is indeed the affirmation of a privatistic model, right? The Roman Empire had naturally a great emphasis on the concept of public, right? The same government was considered fundamentally as such, the res publica, as the empire was mostly the military, a religious legitimization of the power proper. It was a military one. The Germanic world didn't know concept of public, right? They had a simpler society where basically most of the matters were settled by the individual freemen, right? And there were naturally, say, collective regulations that had to especially surveil that no element of society would become too much powerful. Exactly, not in a public sense as we say, oh, look at how egalitarian democratic it was at all, right? This happened exactly because they wanted to leave all the privates to whatever the heck they liked. Also, at that, and especially during the time of the migration era, meaning to build their own lordships on their own, right? At this time, the Germans are not the primitive peoples of the time of Augustus, right? This time, the migration era especially has triggered a great political and social stratification that is not dramatic, actually, because the also just banally the level of material poverty throughout all this world, and especially those regions where not much could have been developed across the Roman borders, had definitely maintained in many of these peoples a certain degree of equality among the various clan leaders. But especially those peoples that had set more on the march, the need for electing a leader and eventually a king was something very strange. The first one was actually Alaric. Otherwise, there wasn't, like the Romans called reges, certain Germanic chieftains. Just think about Ariovistus at the time of Caesar already, but those weren't properly what a Romano-Germanic king was, right? The first examples were definitely Alaric. The Goths were the ones that, not surprisingly, exactly because they were the most Romanized, to be able to build this, that is to say, they had an elite, and specifically a single leader that was backed from the external by the empire and could affirm its power on the various peoples under his control. So, but that was something completely anew, right? And so we don't have to be very rigid and dogmatic either, because, for example, if you take the Franks, Well, these two were very scarcely, stratified as far as we understand. Living in northwestern Germany, that's like there wasn't a dramatic development in that sense. But also the most powerfully, say, I use a big term for the time, but centralized monarchy in the sense that it was properly within more. It's more the monarchic model than the centralization that counts here, right? Because centralization definitely entails a public system that works. It's under Clovis. It's Clovis that takes the big step, right? Also, great leaders like Theodoric, especially, had proven this capacity of power. But Theodoric, as we will see now, was fundamentally framed within a Roman reality, right? Because he was at the head of a Germanic people that was ruling Roman Italy, right? It wasn't an Ostrogothic Italy. Like, eventually it will be, a Longobard or a Byzantine Italy that were the break after the Gothic War will properly happen. But for that matter, he was a Roman commander, right? Or invested as such, right? And of course, he was the king of his own people, but also in a very different reality. And by the way, especially the Ostrogoths were something very particular, especially after the Hunnic domination that had conferred to them a character that was also different from the original one of a Germanic people, right? So there were important differences among the so-called Germanic people that, as we've explained many times, weren't conceiving themselves as such, right? They weren't objectively something unitary or discernible. It's by the 6th century, by Roman ethnographical influence, and because they started writing and had to picture and portray themselves, they begin to call themselves, or to see vaguely them conceive themselves as part of a shared culture. But they could share this culture with other Central European peoples that were not also properly Germanic. It was mostly about their tribal origin than any ethnic or linguistical character, specifically speaking. Or of course, they recognized that they had something in common. They spoke the same language at certain levels, but there were also very, especially during the migration era, very different just groups of different peoples that came from very different areas. Like the Ostrogoths weren't the Franks, right? Let's be honest. There was something dramatically different in this. But the most important thing is that internally, the Germans weren't coming from a statal reality, not even an actually monarchic reality. These were all different clans that fundamentally even retained their names. We talk of these peoples as the Goths, the Franks, the Alemanni, but these people didn't call themselves as such. I mean, they called themselves as such like an international shout-out, right? Here we are the Franci, we are the Alemanni, but with all these things. But the individual clans would think they were themselves, and they had their own specific names, and they didn't actually, as far as you had to present yourself to the empire was a problem, but internally to the people, there were many peoples, right? Let's put it in this way, right? So these were also very, very recent realities that had formed themselves. Many had something in common. Others were much more heterogeneous, like about the Franks and the Alemanni, for example. We see that they came also through definitely a lot of, immigration through lots of other populations, especially of Sarmatic, Iranian origin. After the Hunnic migration, we see it easily from the equipments, from the linguistical differences, but there was also like a geographical area of origin that had at least been for centuries before the migration era kind of stable, so they had kind of developed certain aspects in common. The Franks were probably largely descending from the same populations, for example, that had participated, especially the Salians, to rebel Teutoburg Forest, right? It was those northwestern Germans. The others were coming from the Elbe. For example, the Alemanni were Elbe people, like the Longobards, like the Bavarians, that also actually were... The Bavarians properly weren't even like a people like we think. Like the Longobards have an ethnonym that dates back to easily to before Christ, Like we know it because when the Romans conquered Germany at the very beginning of the 1st century AD, they met and defeated Longobards that were called like that by the Romans themselves. And the Longobards knew that thing from before, and they had migrated from before. So actually Longobards are a bit of an exception. But the Bavarians, for example, were just a group of just Romanized peoples, Celtic people, Germans, Huns. I mean, all you can imagine. And think about the Goths in themselves were the most mixed in absolute terms. The Vandals, as far as we understand, were a Germanic, Proto-Slavic, and Celtic melange, right? So it's very complex even to, and at some point it doesn't even matter to draw an ethnic difference in here, because it's not what really made the difference in terms of who these peoples were concretely, because they had to reinvent who they were at some point. And there were especially lots of elements that were assimilated within that. So even if there was the famous Traditionskern at the base, where this was able to catalyze the inclusion of all these other elements. But this is just a brief note. We'll talk about it on another circumstance. So the private culture did not exist. When Clovis seizes power, he does it over literally beheading all the other various Frankish chieftains. This naturally, you can imagine how brutal and devastating. We talk a lot about the Merovingians and Clovis, right? We'll keep doing it at some point. But that was something utterly shocking for Germanic culture. I mean, nobody had ever seen it conceived even anything like that. Clovis went sword in hand, destroying great part of what that original balance of the people actually was, and established, though, and this is the value and the controversial value always of civilization, something that no Germanic power had ever seen, right? And building especially this power on his own monarchic, private power. That is to say that everything in the Frankish kingdom belonged to the king, in this sense. Like the Clovis and his descendants, so the whole Frankish kingdom and his foreign dependencies, as you know, because it was properly an empire since the beginning. Like, it's not a Carolingian thing. The Franks had already created that. Better the Merovingians. Let's see, because this is properly the point. It was a dynastic thing. Dynasties, in a German perspective, were something atrocious, right? One thing was at a clanic level, of course, as long as you couldn't impose it all over the people. This is what the Merovingians are able to do. And that's because they believe it belongs to them. Like, we have conquered this thing, so it belongs to us. The divinity wants us to rule in this. Otherwise, we would have not made it, because no achievement is human. It's all about divine power conferred to mortals. That's it. So that was the full entitlement. And the Franks were very superficially Romanized at so many levels. They were also very superficially Christianized. But they managed, through the assimilation in the Gallo-Roman society, and eventually thanks also to the very powerful Gallo-Roman elites that were especially the one of the clergy of the dioceses, to create this enormous thing that was essentially a Catholic kingdom. As you know, the Franks didn't even pass through the Arian heresy. Like, all the other Germanic peoples were Arians at some point, right? In their path, they eventually all became Catholic, right? But we have also explained Arianism on multiple occasions. The Clovis gets straight to the Roman Catholicism, and that tells you how brutally different that brutally accelerated the process, the transition towards a German to a Roman context was pressed by the Merovingians. This problem of the lack of a sense of public authority is the same one. You could point out at least in relative terms, at the major factor that would bring to the fall of the Carolingian Empire as well, because there was no force throughout the early medieval times that could confer to these people like a fully centralized reality. Also, the Gallo-Roman bishops that of course married into the Germanic aristocracy and vice versa, also because at the time, it was normal for bishops to, absolutely normal to marry and have children, and they basically lived just like a Germanic chieftains, or at least, now something mixed between the two models, as warriors, by the way, right? These were military leaders, commanders, right? And that's where the thing starts getting interesting, because this is all just a huge private clientele. There's nothing like a state anymore. There's not a public magistracy. The cities usually maintain something of that, like the city had the municipia, and the civitates in the Roman Empire had their own enormous pride and prestige, and that's why also, for example, also in the Frankish world, that after all got, more quickly Germanized than other areas of Gaul, especially of the south, where the Roman element remained for a very long time. The cities, after all, kept living on, right? Differently from Britain, where yes, the base was still there in some ways, but it was much weaker. Many more cities went abandoned. In Gaul, there was still the persistency of city militias, for example. They were all framed under framed in a Roman fashion at the beginning, right? And we know that especially in the early Merovingian times, they participated. To the army, to the military expeditions consistently. We've seen it in the video on the Merovingian military organization, if I'm not wrong. And Merovingian Gaul is an example of this, I'd say better Frankish Gaul, because to differentiate Merovingian Empire from the Frankish kingdom proper, so that it's properly also, there is a geographical divide north of the Loire, is a good example of, I would say, the average change in Western Europe, right? It's very peculiar on its own. The Merovingians, reinforced ecclesiastical power in very consistent fashion. They, however, maintained power over it, unlike the Visigoths that basically lost. The Visigothic king lost their power to the councils, to the councils of Toledo, to the Ibero-Roman Visigothic aristocracy, basically, of which they were expression. But in terms of degree of abandonment of Roman administration in civil as well as military affairs, that's a pretty good example. It's not as brutal as in Anglo-Saxon England, or Italy is not so, just more strongly from the Roman side of the story than the Visigoths, right? So it's well balanced as an example. So in many ways, the kings at that point are the holders of the assets that are needed to rule the whole kingdom, whereas in Roman times this mostly depended on a public administration, so that it doesn't matter which usurper came, which federati established in there. There was something that worked along that line, and of course also the Franks controlled this, like others do. The problem is that, as we have seen, the broader political and social system contracted at some point, so that these things could not work as much as they had worked before. Just the separation from the Roman Empire in terms of direct control, or eventually the contraction of the same Roman Empire capabilities after the Islamic invasions to threaten an invasion of some other formerly Roman territory, like it happened in Italy or in southern Spain and Africa, North Africa, brought to the idea, of course, that also this administration had to be resized on a local scale, because objectively it was useless to continue maintaining a connection between realities that at that point were ever more distant, and it would have costed too much, and simply they ran out of energies, right? And most of the way they did, at least I'm personally convinced of it, especially looking at the Merovingian military history, is that they really consumed all this stuff with wars, right? These systems were naturally more unstable than the Roman Empire had been. They constantly fought against each other, and there is probably they wear out their energy, right? There is properly the idea, you can't see generation after generation, in a couple of centuries, that there's ever less. Just look at the size of the armies. It's probably decreased. At the time of Clovis, the Franks had an enormous military power. At the times of Clovis' sons or grandsons, you realize that the thing had become much more, much smaller. And this happened more or less in all of these countries, with the peak reaching essentially in the 7th century, especially in the mid-7th century. There are also all these various private powers that naturally get delegated by the king in a way, but once again, it's not more than a private clientele, right? All the bishops, for example, that belonged to the various chunks that the Franks subdued, Aquitaine, Burgundy, Alemannia, and Thuringia, and so on, were fundamentally appointed by the kings to rule in their stead, and over the generations they simply autonomized themselves as local lords. That's also what much of the confiscation of land, of ecclesiastical land that happened from the beginning of the 8th century under Pippin the Short was really about, right? It's not the evil Frankish king that takes away, the tiny land plot from the poor local priest that is working the land humbly. They basically took back what was conceptually part of monarchic possession from hell of, political and military leaders that the bishops had become by that point, and that had, in the meanwhile, contributed to stratify even more society in their own regard. Right? It's very interesting also to look at the names of the various these various lords in the various areas of Europe. Also the various semantic differences depending on how much the local power was more or less inspired to the Roman model, right? The Franks, for example, were very much inspired by the Roman model, so that they mostly had the counts, the comites, right? Other peoples like the Longobards were much more Germanic, cultured from a political institutional point of view. They had the duces, properly the dukes, the stressed the military, the essentially military nature of that command. This doesn't mean that the Franks, were less German than the Longobards from a cultural point of view, right? This is a matter of political and institutional models that come to be formed, right? We could expand on this topic, but let's leave it here for now. Another important aspect is the local military garrisoning, right? The protection of the so-called limes, right, of the Roman boundaries, eclipsed almost completely at this point, because surprise, surprise, the frontiers changed, right? So actually, the limitanae didn't disappear all of a sudden. Not even the mobile army actually did, and the certain units simply flowed into the Germanic kings' retinues or even bodyguards, right? There is extensive evidence of this at many levels, especially during the first half of the 6th century. And yet, there were still certain continuities with naturally the local garrisoning and that during Roman times and the new needs of defense during, let's say, Germanic times. The problem is that the frontiers had simply jumped. So just only from a political point of view, as we've seen, these monarchies were on average weaker. They had a lower vitality than the Roman administration in the previous centuries. So we could say that frontiers multiplied within this territory. So no place, like, think about just all the assets that it took to, one thing is the enemies are just outside the borders, for a territory that stretches, in fact, from Scotland to the Persian Gulf, and it's internally pacified. Just think about, as a political and social toll, about the cost of all this territory that gets militarized in a way or another. Right? There is not much of military professionalism anymore, but it means that every freeman is basically responsible for policing his own community, his own villages, districts, so on, and it costs a freaking lot. In all of this, economy has sunk, material poverty has risen. There's been a brusque contraction of just of exchange. So just thinking even about all the the technological, that we don't give much importance to technology, but speaking of of warfare, is one of the least important aspects. But think just about all the componentistics, or the the difference that it makes for when a market, a broader, a universal and ecumenic market closes, and you have to rely just on the local resources. This is much more problematic for a lot of even equipment, right? And there is a general impoverishment of equipment. At this time, metal armor was something rare, right? Not very rare, but became now quite difficult to find, even within the Roman army. Look at the army of Belisarius in Italy. They had basically they built armor with wood, which is also pretty good, telling the truth, because they didn't have simply resources that become too difficult to find. And naturally, war, as we were saying before, in general, consumes a lot of resources, mostly the agricultural ones. It's not that agricultural resources keep growing after the war happened. No, because if the war itself has destroyed the whole infrastructure, right, it becomes really difficult now to restart as well. It will take centuries. So there is a general insecurity, becomes widespread in all of these, quite a standard area. No region could claim to be fundamentally pacific as it could be before. Every individual, every social or familiar group had to provide for their own security, right? Defend its own rights, its own interests with arms. For the Germans, this was actually daily business, right? We know that the Fahrgemeinschaft look at the Longobards Fahre, for example, that maintain even the etymology in Latin and in certain Italian toponyms today, were basically single clans that were self-sufficient from every point of view. Right, during the Great Migrations, they were logistically sufficient. They found food on their own. Along the way, they were a military community. They were a clan. They were very close-knit. Right, they did everything alone, because out there in the barbaricum of Central Europe, of Eastern Europe, and Northern Europe, that's how they had been living. Right, there was no other way. It was no state, no king. Every clan dealt with that on their own. It goes without saying, naturally, that their settlement, their sedentarization brings to radical changes in their way of lives, because we have to naturally stress, which is never enough, that these people migrated because they wanted to stop living like that, right? Or better, they didn't rationalize it in this sense, but what these peoples were always looking for were better pastures, for essentially, areas with better agricultural resources, so that they didn't have to leave the way they did anymore. So these broader areas of the empire had been also historically the ones alongside the Romans had expanded in, because their system could be supported just by those agricultural resources, whereas outside the Roman boundaries, this was, inconvenient, right? It would have required too many expenses. So these people come, and of course they settle. They temporarily subdue properly, from a military point of view, the vanquished, in a servile relation or something close to it. There are lots of variations even in here, but in a few generations it all ends, right? We will see it better now. And these people become sedentarized, and also they abandon their previous way of life. They change their mind, right? I'm sorry I'm telling all of this stuff, but we can't expand with singular examples because it would take too much. But if you go in the Migration Era playlist, we actually discussed this stuff at length on multiple occasions. And also, the Roman communities, after all, weren't that bad at defending themselves. That is to say that throughout all late antiquity, the idea that fundamentally the local powers, including the church, had to organize the military resistance to invasions and so on was pretty normal, right? So the Roman societies were already habituated to this kind of lifestyle themselves, right? The Germanic soldiers had been present in the armies with their uses, customs, and practices for centuries, right? So there was properly no brutal change, right? The brutal change could arrive with a single invasion, with a single war, with a single destruction, but the ways in which this whole thing was organized actually changed very gradually. Nobody actually perceived the change more than much on a broader scale. There is also another point that the Germans brought with themselves the usage of as freemen to bear arms, right? And this was a privilege reserved to the conquerors at the beginning, but it basically spread all over the population, while naturally the ethnical, juridical, cultural fusion between the vanquishers and vanquished was realized. And this also tells you how these peoples couldn't basically rule these lands without the support of the population, because otherwise this one would have not been allowed to be armed in the first place. And as a consequence, there is also the leveling of the difference between public war and private violence. This is extremely important, right? Because that's the difference between a state and a tribe in many ways. The feud, the revenge, and the war led by the king in the name of his own people seem at this point to be dramatically close to each other as single actions, right? There are wars that engulf a whole kingdom just for familial reason. Ask the Merovingians, right? And that's a bit the proof of that complete absence of public mentality that the Germans had, right? They didn't see the difference. They didn't see the greater good, where at every generation they had to split the entire kingdom to the various princes, because each and every one of them wanted their own chunk, their own equal chunk, because why am I? You gave me less. Obviously, they started fighting against each other, and this is also part of the reason why certain areas like the Merovingian kingdom declined, fragmented. Like at the end of the 7th century, there wasn't physically consistently anymore like a Frankish kingdom even anymore, because they had split into essentially these 4 sub-kingdoms that until the Carolingian times were not properly recomposed. This is present at every level of society. We see people going armed everywhere. This is in many ways typical of the Middle Ages, right? Or better, not the fact really of being armed going everywhere, because also the Middle Ages brought with the strengthening of public power at some point to the disarming of the population, right? And don't think that this didn't properly happen, in the sense that, yeah, the broader political picture could be fragmented, but at a local level, and I always make the example of Gaul because it's the most representative, but, in their own tiny yard, every lord naturally began to disarm the peasantry, right? There are these wide areas of the empire that were already disarmed since centuries, right? There were provinces like Italy, for example, they didn't even bear arms since centuries anymore because they had gentrified and eventually impoverished, so they had become, colonists, and so the same population was not up to arms because there weren't the infrastructures, there wasn't the mentality, there wasn't the assets for it. And don't think that violence cannot resurge, because, for example, in Gothic, during the Gothic War, what Totila does is exactly by fighting against the Romans. Romans means at that point Byzantine Empire means Roman latifundia, locally speaking, Roman senators that are one person over, 100,000. I'm just throwing it like that, but that's the point. What do? They free the colonists. They tell them, you are serfs, and the gods were fighting against, they were considering themselves freemen, but they realized that they needed these Roman peasants, to be armed as manpower, as not just as labor, but as a fighting force, with the promise that it would have become Germans themselves. And this is actually what happened, paradoxically, thanks to the most devastating destructions of the Gothic War in that process, with the Longobards domination, right? Longobards Italy gets, from a cultural point of view, almost completely Germanized. There is nobody who thinks he's a Roman anymore, because all the people from the king, Longobard Duke, and the peasantry were at that point Longobard, even if they had nothing to do with the conquerors. Were just like from 1 to 3% of the whole Italian population. The same happens, for example, in Anglo-Saxon England. That's why these two areas are very similar. Whereas in Gaul and in Spain, what happens is that the aristocracy, the Roman aristocracy that had been destroyed in Britain, had been destroyed in Italy, keeps ruling the peasantry. So in Spain, in Gaul, what do you think also in future European history, such well-structured, kingdom? Well, maybe it's a long shot, but why feudalism essentially would take such a root in those areas? Because of course the peasantry had never been properly freed from a factual point of view. That had always remained peasants. There had always been the guy on horseback who was a military professional that fought because all of this enormous amount of people worked for him for doing that and for protecting the whole community. Other countries of Europe weren't like that, right? Banally take Scandinavia as the bare thing. At that point, every freeman was armed. It was a dramatically poor, backward society, but at least there were very few leaders if you're concerned about the democracy of it, right? Gaul is the complete opposite. In there are the nobles that are hell of nobles that rule, right? And even a tiny noble in Gaul, at that point, Merovingian times, is actually richer than, not everyone, but even a simple lord a modest lord in Gaul could be richer even than a Longobard king, because the distribution of wealth was completely different. If you study Wickham, he has actually studied extensively these differences, and they make you see why, for example, in Longobard Italy, that was a completely Germanic kingdom from a juridical, institutional point of view. You have also the most Romanized institutions. And this is the dichotomy we should start thinking like, right? Because of course there the society was more Roman than it was in Northern Gaul, right? But it's a game of elites. There is also the juridical institution of the Wehrgeld that was proper of Germanic societies that, in fact, was destined to put an end in that world to a chain of violence, because there was no other way to impose it there was no authority at the top that could do it. So basically people made justice by themselves, and it sucked as a system. But even in this sedentarized society, it was transformed in a fashion that under certain aspects at least could be considered a sort of ransom, an indemnity of war that was paid to the harmed, the injured part, let's say. This is also fascinating because it makes you realize that there was a negotiation now of the composition of political and military contrasts, right? There is the idea that the matter is not just a matter of state. It's fundamentally about you and the other person and how you can settle it, right? And once again, it also sucks. And in fact, the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, the more they develop, they will try to get rid of things like judicial duel, because objectively they're simply dumb and uncivilized. There is no justice. But it was at that point so imbued in the local populations that it was difficult to eradicate, if not impossible. There's a beautiful law from Liutprand at the beginning of the 8th century that states that, here we tried to get rid of this idiocy of judicial duel that is even against God, because at that time the Liutprand, as a longer king, was fully Catholic, was very, he heard a lot about these things, but we know, he says, as a king, that we cannot enforce it, right? And don't think that in our own society such things are not there. That objectively there is an evident injustice, but the state cannot really do much about it. Of course, the state can do dramatically much compared to this one, but don't think that the problems of settling a matter are so morally different today from what they were at the time, because the principle is the same. So here we have drawn quite also dramatically the picture of, as we were saying before, the most, the areas that got more quickly Germanized in Western Europe. However, we have to point out certain elements that intervene to shade such contrast between the Roman and the Germanic perspective, because in practice, it was never fully like this. So, first of all, since the late Roman Empire, and for reasons that at that point couldn't really be prevented, the military aspect of the imperial function had been strongly accentuated, right? Also, because of the influence of the barbarian customs that is witnessed, for example, think about how Julian was proclaimed emperor by his soldiers, raised on a shield with all the weapons banging ding, like it happened in the Germanic assemblies, where the military leaders were elected temporarily, right, because they didn't want any king. Here the same Roman emperor was acclaimed like that. About this, it would be an entire video we could make, because we shouldn't think that the Romans, since the beginning, were actually distant from these military cultures, right? That's often like unfortunately, these ideas have spread like crazy since 19th century. Nationalistic / racist historiography had to stress it. That is to say, this deep divide between the Romans and the Germans. This, as if these were two completely opposite worlds. We're talking about ancient times. These worlds were dramatically close to each other at so many levels, and the same Romans shared, of course, a lot of principles, of ideals, of characters that the same barbarian cultures had. The Romans emerged from the same background, right? And they always maintained this properly military mindset. Like, they were a warlike empire, a ferociously aggressive, expansionistic system that now had definitely developed a state such, but had never, it's not a modern state, it's not a fully centralized state, it's a state where still the individual counts a lot for his own intrinsic qualities, for his relation with the gods, or with God, which here doesn't really matter, right? Because also the pagans had actually no problem to accept the existence of a Christian God. Also, since the Roman Empire became Christian, and they were dramatically interested in sharing part of that power, because, of course, no matter if you were, pagan or a theist, the military glory descended exclusively from heaven, right? So one was worth the other, and in this vision, the syncretism was dramatically widespread. We've seen it with the Alemanni before the Battle of Strasbourg, that some Alemannic chieftains were initiated to the Serapic cults that existed. I don't remember where, if in Lyon, in Lugdunum, or that's something that came from from the Near East, right? It's some like it was all much more boundless than when we made it. Julian, he was proclaimed emperor in 360. Of course, that was a moment in which the Romans had also began to know pretty well all these other, there had been the crisis of the 3rd century, various Germanic confederations were on the move, so there was a deep commixtion, hybridization between these cultures already happening. And in fact, around Julian at the time, there were, as many other emperors since even Augustus, there were many military men, often of Germanic origin, right? This happened really since the time of Augustus. The idea of picking a foreigner as the bodyguard of the emperor, because they were completely outside of the local political games. They were very well paid, and of course they wouldn't like to lose their job. And so these were presences that had always been there to one another, right? And leaving aside all the other nationalities in that sense, or the various auxilia that came from all over the world, known world at the time. And since the reign of Constantine onwards, the independence of the military from the prefects of the praetorium, the vicari of the proconsuls, and the governors of the provinces had been strengthened, at the point that the military commanders, the magistri equitum and the magistri peditum, the duces, the comites, depended by this point only on imperial authority. So the old principle of cedent arma toge didn't have value anymore, right? Civil power lost its imminence in this sense. And you can argue that in the Roman Empire it had never been fully like that, right? Of course, as we've seen, the various powers were much more militarized than they had been before. But during the previous centuries, even the civil administration still depended fundamentally on the imperial authority. It was fundamentally military and religious in nature. So this is also a somewhat too modernistic and secularized view of what the empire concretely was, right? The major magistracies of the Roman Empire had an imperium within themselves. So it's particularly important to stress that, after all, the prevalence of arms in Roman mentality had never died out at some point, had just decreased, and here we can observe a further remilitarization because of the instability of the system and various civil wars, usurpations, invasions, and so on, that obliged the authorities to actually pair, or to make a synthesis of civil and military power. And that's essentially what Diocletian reforms, especially as far as we understand terms of administration, especially in taxation, were aimed at, so that every community locally had the military means to react to threats. In fact, even the service in civilian office was considered the same level of a militia proper. Certainly was distinguished from the militia armata, so the armed militia, but that, however, contemplated the obligation to wear a military uniform and the belt, the cingulum. That was historically actually what really differentiated the military men from the civilians, and that would remain, famously enough, in medieval society and warfare, the distinction of the militia, of the knights, the cingulum militaris, right? He who could bear the cingulum, of course, was the belt to which the sword, the scabbard, was fastened, right? So that was the point. He who had the cingulum had the sword. Now, if you consider that the Germans were all armed, at least the freemen, because they had also their own slaves and serfs, But this is pretty much the same thing, isn't it? Right? Of course, the two systems kind of influence each other at certain levels, because definitely the Romans inspired this greater, complexity of military organizations in the Germanic world. The Germans also, re-injected these military values in the Roman world from the spring of the tribalism. But it's two parallel ways. It's being up to arms. It's think about the mandatory levy in a society, right? Today, largely in certain countries, it's not a problem anymore, because especially since the Cold War. But just to make an example, right? I didn't do military service. I actually volunteered at one point to go into it, but I didn't before my generation. Well, my fathers, they went regularly to the army. So even just the fact that, mentally speaking, you're apt to clean a rifle, and to receive orders, to know what it means to live in a barrack, to be part of to be framed under a hierarchy, to have a spirit of the corps, a sense of duty, and so on. It's something that certain generations have, others don't. And here it was a bit like that, in the same way. Consider that throughout all the early Roman Empire, the Roman army was exclusively voluntary, right? The military service was voluntary. Like that, in theory, of course, certain levies were, commanded. You had to serve forcibly, but the Roman army as such was made exclusively by volunteers. The Romans didn't do any military service. During the late Roman Empire, instead, more than a military service, it's required now that always a fixed number of people have to join, have to be recruited, because they're properly needed. They need to be spent, right? And also those that remain home, they have to organize their own military defense. And it's not that before the local militias hadn't existed. Like, you have the Roman Empire with all the Roman legions and the various auxiliary units stationed chiefly along the boundaries, which were properly the armed forces in terms of even just sheer military power. Then it's not that the rest of the empire that wasn't properly militarized. Of course, the majority of the population was disarmed, but the Roman government allowed a certain degree of militarization, certain realities, to have local militias, right? This flattened over time. This was also a matter, think about all the various client states of Rome that initially had their own army, right? They were pre-existing polities. They had their own armies. That's it. They ended up under Rome, but over time they grew weaker and ever more dependent on the Roman military assistance, and therefore at some point their armed forces didn't work anymore. That the Romans had to simply go there and to make it the new frontier. And this was very blurred in perspective, but there is properly a process of demilitarization of the Roman population we were seeing before. The great masses of the colonists working in the Latifonia couldn't be armed. Why would you arm them? So they can revolt, right? These people were treated, they were serfs basically. And these are being regularly disarmed. The slaves were disarmed, except in certain cases of emergency, which could be armed. It could happen, I don't know, during the Second Punic War in other circumstances, but it was not the normality, right? But just for seeing a certain even gear, outfit, and uniform that corresponded to certain specific political and social statuses appeared now, right? Especially with Diocletian's reforms, that the Roman subjects were ever more framed under this segmentation that required for every person that to carry out the craft of his father. So if your father was a soldier, you were expected to become a soldier, a professional one at least, in that sense. For what concerns the Pax Romana, Roman peace, the Roman pacification, many regions of the empire were pretty troubled, right? Since the 30s, revolts, rebellions have always been there, but certain regions, especially the least Romanized ones, and there's not properly a geographical thing, but rather, sometimes it was just a subdivision in the same society, right? But certain areas were endemically agitated, right? Peace was disrupted by certain popular uprisings. Take the one of the Bagaudi in Gaul, right? These people, we don't properly know what it is. If it was a social thing, was some relic of Celtic resistance. After half of a millennium of Roman domination, you think it's something eternal to it, but it really comes from this broader oppression and margination, and also just by the same of the lower social classes, but also the same opportunity to seize control of areas that remained not enough protected, right? Wherever an authority shrinks, of course there is someone who takes over. This happens everywhere. This happened also with the Circonceliones in Africa. That was also, essentially a rural movement of all these, serfs, slaves, brigands that went destroying. That was mixed all with religious motivations as well. But it's always the same story. It's this extremistic fringes that want to, that fight against, a system that has its shortcomings. And by the way, these as long as the central power could, these rebellions were eradicated. That the Romans weren't very tender in this sense. Rebellion was a capital crime. If you were a rebel, you were, the Romans respected those enemies that fought as free men and then lost and then were subjected, and they might have been lenient with them depending on the situation. But if you had been subdued and you rebelled, then there was no mercy. Like you could consider yourself consistently done for. There are examples of this, but just to make you understand that, of course, phenomena like brigandage and piracy, because this is also what the invasions, by a certain degree, where, especially at the beginning, always happen, where there is local power that becomes weaker, generally in those contexts, because the Romans were fighting one against the other. So it's obviously not about much the external threat that causes the strike. It's about the internal system that remains exposed, right? We don't have to always think that invasions were the active destroyers, right? They didn't help, and if they hadn't been there, the Roman Empire probably would have gone on. But the point is that if they started happening after centuries where you don't even hear about piracy in Roman sources, the whole Roman Empire for centuries, right? After Pompey had the expense of the Cilician pirates, after that Spartacus, fell, Spartacus we don't probably know, but probably was exterminated. Nobody had really felt the need to rebel anymore. Yeah, there were rebellions here and there, of course, as we were saying before, but there weren't major problems in that regard. And still, society is fluid, it's mobile, right? So things can happen for the most different reasons. The provincial hierarchies also have interest in autonomy, so they sometimes back these movements at the same time. But naturally, it's for what the Romano-Germanic relations were involved, the penetration and the settlement of initially small group of barbarians, even before the tide of the great invasions, were a phenomenon that the Romans were mindful of, that they even accepted, because especially towards the late Roman Empire, they needed manpower. So these people were settled properly somewhere, which is what they wanted, right? There was no need. If there was enough, it was a place to make a living in. You would go there, and the Roman authorities would accept that, because what did they care after all? As long as the people paid taxes and you could control the territory, it was fine. It was even incentivated. In fact, it was part of the settlement of barbarian people was one of the first policies, let's say, of the Roman emperors and great part of their propaganda. Look at Theodosius. Look at all these emperors that had not just exterminated whatever people had tried to cross the Roman borders, like it could happen a few centuries before. No, they had defeated them and then had settled them, scattered them within the Roman borders, and they had transformed them from ferocious barbarians into, mild peasants who would pay taxes for Rome, would serve the army, and so on. And in all this picture, as we've seen, the powerful people, the elite, the senators mostly, in their holdings that were becoming ever larger, while the middle classes were shrinking and all becoming poorer and going to work in their land. In fact, in the senatorial land, behaved already as lords, right? These were senators, then bishops, because bishops came from largely from the same senatorial families. As we've seen, they were also, they got married, they had children the same way. It's obvious that even in here the word differences compared, especially to the various regions where this happened, because also eventually the Christianization of the elite was something. It was more complete, where the elite was truly elite in many ways, and used also this instrument to legitimize its power ever more, right? But the bishops properly ruled the cities, right? So it's not in the surroundings, of course. So these are like, you can say, city-state is a big word, but think about what a city was in the early Middle Ages. Most of the people would overwhelmingly live, also as it was actually during the Roman Empire, telling the truth, in the countryside. But the city, even just having stone walls, right, and a settlement defended by the circle, it was something formidable, infrastructurally speaking. People had a huge power. The market was inside of it. The riches were stored there. There was also military organization, as we've seen. But naturally, cities decline as well, and it's the rural world that in certain areas takes over. For example, the Merovingians we were discussing before were mostly centered in this very big households in the countryside. Not much. They had their own residence in cities, very important ones like Paris, since these times already, Lutetia Parisiorum, or also Durocortorum, it was Rheims. There were many other important cities in what had been the Belgica. But also these other lords fundamentally start to rule from the countryside, sometimes from their own villa, right? They were often, so what the Roman villa was initially speaking just as a country residence, but at the head it was a large business, a large farming system with specialized crop and so on, and that was already often an important structure, but now it starts acquiring ever more military characters. Was an encircle meant with a tower, right? They often started to assume the aspect of fortified houses. We don't have to think of just like the big thing as an effective fortification. It just takes to be, its walls to be thick enough, and at this point, even catapults, as we were saying before, or certain technologies are starting to get lost. If you have this massive stone walls, the best you can do sometimes is just to wait, to surround the thing if you have enough resources, logistically speaking, which usually sometimes you don't have. And it would be enough to stay out brigands and other threats, these bands that wandered around. It was a necessity. So these were fortified houses proper. If you take Libanius de Patrocinis, there's a narration of the author, you can see how the institutions have become especially sensible to the military character, to cope with the communities, with the reality of the time. So passing to the Ostrogoths, and Theodoric, especially Theodoric's reign. Well, you know the story, right? The Ostrogoths were sent from Illyricum. They regathered fundamentally after the Hunnic invasions of the Pannonian Plain, and were settled in the Illyricum by the Roman Empire, and eventually they were sent to Italy to in 489. There was this war that lasted 4 years against Odoacer. That was the guy that had sent back the Western imperial insignia to Constantinople, so that we all, on all history book we know about 476 AD, which is a year in which absolutely nothing happened, and for the rest. And so that was simply Roman Italy. That's it. The Constantinople, of course, doesn't like at all to have this pretty large, actually, group of these Germanic people on its boundaries on the Danube. So they have this good idea that they sent them to Italy to take over and to establish a Roman government on behalf, right, in the peninsula. This passes through the rise among the Ostrogoths, or that at the time weren't even called like that, technically speaking, but of properly a king who was appointed as such as Magister Otriusque Militiae. It was a title that was, you know what it is, it's the master of both militias, means Magister Equitum and Magister Peritum, so basically at this point the whole army. And I consider that the Ostrogoths had been settled in Illyricum in this sense, right? The relation with the Federati entailed that they often took over the same military function at a local level. So they were asked by Constantinople to do the same, and were allowed to do the same in Italy, granting them the government of the peninsula. These things were very important. Like Clovis, for example, had received the vicary of the Gauls, right? Even the title of patrician was very common. Odoacer had received the title of Rex Gentium, if I'm not wrong, specifically because he was at the head, not of properly of a Germanic people, but simply of the former army of Italy that was just composed by Federati, virtually, that came from all different nations in that regard. Theodoric is one of the great last kings to lead the migration of its own people, and it's probably the first time that someone, that a Germanic people settles in Italy as a whole. Italy at this point had not been destroyed, had not suffered major devastation. The whole Western world had contracted, but Roman government, infrastructures, institutions, administration went on. The Roman Senate was there, the Pope was there as well. Odoacer ruled from Ravenna, where he was eventually, he capitulated and was killed by Theodoric. That starts ruling in Ravenna, that had been, as you know, in fact, the residence of the last Western Roman emperors. Under the Goths, Italy had actually much better time than what it had had under the last Western Roman emperors. And we made even a video about this, and we will keep talking about Ostrogothic Italy, because as I told you before, this is one of the single most important chapters of the Romano-Germanic kingdoms in general. Most people do not even contemplate the fact that Romans and Germans were perfectly coexisting in this reality under the observation of Constantinople. This was a florid period for, juridically, artistically, culturally, broadly meant that the Roman senators sat together with the Germanic chieftains at Theodoric's consistorium of Ravenna, that simply Theodoric's, Germans were the army, and the Romans kept working in their civil business. We mostly have a disruptive picture, whatever the invasions has been. This is one of those chapters that really make you reconsider the whole thing. And in perspective, the real messed up thing was the Gothic War, that is actually the Roman reconquest, that really messes up the whole thing, right? Also, no, the Longobards didn't mess up further anything, right? They actually gave finally an important stabilization to most of the peninsula's levels. We'll have to talk about that once again, because there is this idea, also especially from the Byzantine side of the story, that these were just a bunch of barbarians that were incapable of doing anything. People rarely even know what these Romano-Germanic kingdoms were about, and that's also why we make so many videos about them, because actually they accomplished a freaking lot in historical perspective, and this is dramatically overlooked in Western European perspective, that there is so much to learn about these experiments that I personally don't see it explained anywhere. Right, everybody's obsessed about the ruler that comes, that conquers, just to satisfy the expectations of a morally unbalanced audience, and nobody explains what the true and most important history was about. In a comprehensive perspective, right? And so, of course, there was a legal fiction here, because Theodoric was at the head of a Roman army, technically, but composed uniquely by Germans, because the Romans were prevented to join. Right? This had been properly the thing. This system was normal for the Hospitalitas standards. You know what the Hospitalitas was about? The Federati, that is the allies of Rome, the Symmachoi, as it were starting to be called also in the mostly Greek-speaking East, were simply settled in this Roman lands. So nobody, with Theodoric included, thought that this was not a part of the Roman Empire, right? And they would simply take over the military administration, right? Because these peoples were peoples in arms, technically. As we've seen, every freeman was expected to serve as a warrior, as a fighter. And since they were already militarized, that is, technically, the Romans needed a training to form a professional militia, professional army that always remained, more effective than what the Germans could field in average terms. But these peoples were, all well tested by this continuous warfare that happened on the frontiers, right? So they were already militarized in their own way. And of course, even Ostrogothic Italy lasted a relatively few time, some generation, but of course, even in there is a change that starts taking place. The Ostrogoths surely are settled, especially on certain strategic areas, mostly northern Italy and in central and northern Italy, in the Po Valley, in the Apennines. It was the most important strategical areas for the control of the peninsula, and they also the least paradoxically least Romanized, in fact, so that this tells you that also Roman administration in the rest of the peninsula worked fairly well, like didn't need even the military presence of them, so, or at least they could be easily controlled. And the point, though, in all this is that the Romans didn't need to serve. They didn't also want to pose themselves in opposition to the Ostrogothic presence. They accepted it, right? There was this happy coexistence, as we have seen. There was the realization, of course, that these were foreigners that had been sent now by a power like Constantinople, was perceived as increasingly more distant from even from a Western Roman perspective. But everything was fine, right? It was a pacific moment, right? It was a florid time. Theodoric famously extended his protection over the Visigothic kingdom. It began to to even make alliances with Central European Germanic peoples, that the gods were Arians, and this is the time in which Clovis has already created the Catholic Merovingian Empire. So many peoples, as for example the Thuringians, even the Alemanni, the Alemanni get crashed at this point, and Theodoric by the Franks, and Theodoric settles them as their relics, at least on the Alpine passes, to protect Italy from the Danubian watershed side. And he creates this system that is basically Arian Europe versus Catholic Europe, so that basically the Franks and the Byzantines are against it. And it's very fascinating because in many ways this will replicate itself again with the Longobards, and in fact the Franks at that point probably will try to invade Italy, and together with the Byzantines, whereas after the Gothic War, the Franks had remained observing, and they just launched a deep raid in Byzantinely, let's use this adverb, reconquered Italy up to the south, to actually against the Byzantines, right? Because they just, why not? Right? Some duke was sent to some count, because they were also Alemanni, not just Franks at that point. Just another proof that even after the destruction, the only way to rule those peoples for the Franks was also to co-opt their aristocracies in many ways. So, actually, Ostrogothic Italy is this bright time, and it also shows some assimilation from one side to another. It was said also, because the gods, as we were saying before, it's not that they were particularly happy to have a king, but once they were settled in the word the minority, demographically speaking, in Italy, and Theodoric played naturally with the local aristocracies to consolidate his own power and to diminish the one of the free Gothic people, right? And naturally there were factions in this that would emerge. In fact, also after Theodoric's death, would cause many problems, including the offering the casus belli for the Byzantine intervention, because there was the stock. Also, there was all the problem of Catholicism and Arianism. Generally speaking, there was a more traditionalistic Germanic party that wanted just to exclusively rule and to remain, not to integrate, especially the Catholic elites, right? So this was not because they actually cared much about the religious problem. Yes, they were Christian, but they were Arians. Come on, they were coming generation before they were coming from the Danubian area. They were pagans, fundamentally. So there was a bit of rationalization, a bit of emotional side of the story. Then there were the pro-Roman and pro-Catholic side that also in Ostrogothic history had usually a more important meaning, because it's not that these peoples could hope for a very long time to remain Arian, right? As we have seen, all these peoples would be obliged for simple intelligence to convert to Catholicism, because how could you govern, especially in these western provinces, most Romanized, most Christianized, and more populated, by the way, and also richer, so that where the people also have more resources to turn potentially against you to remain Arian, not integrate the rest of the population. Madness, right? The gods in the Ostrogoths didn't have enough time. Probably they would have done it themselves at some point. But during Theodoric's time, the same Germanic army had acquired Roman titles. They were called as duces, comites, tribuni, prefecti, right? So these were Germanic people. All in all, of course, they could have, Sarmatian origins, Hunnic origins, whatever. There were surely some Romans that along the Danube were, had become part of the Ostrogothic people, just to go to Italy and to be re-injected into Romanity in some way. But they had all the ranks and organization of the Roman army. There would be a lot to tell about this, because you see, the Germans had been fighting the Roman army for centuries and centuries, right? Since the time of Caesar, possibly even before, in some measure. look at the Notitia Dignitatum. Look at how, all the various most evident totemic symbols, or at least those of the steps of like the wolves. There are lots of this symbols that we know were attached also to Germanic, Celtic units. They were fighting with Roman equipment, Roman training, Roman officers. So trying to distinguish here like an Ostrogothic warrior, let's put it, and a Roman legionnaire. I mean, it doesn't make much sense, does it? And a part of the troops was settled in the castella of the various provinces of frontier that were there wasn't just Italy. The Ostrogothic domains had all the Alpine and partly, middle Danubian area. Talking about Rhaetia, Pannonia, Dalmatia, the Sabia, right? So very important areas strategically speaking, because they controlled the Danube, all the Alpine passes. So the Ostrogoths were a power to be reckoned with at this point, and they basically worked in these local fortresses as the continuators of the late Roman Limitani, right? These were essentially Germanic clans that were settled there to maintain these castles, these locks at the Alpine foothills, and controlled river crossings, all this stuff. And they worked essentially as the Roman Limitani had done. They were probably sided to pre-existing units in this sense. They were settled and dispersed among them. We have seen the Alemanni also in the Swiss Alps that were settled by the Ostrogoths in the same function. The Comites Civitatum also were the chieftains posted at the head of the Gothic residences of the interland cities of the Ostrogothic kingdom. And then there were the Duces Provinciarum, so the provincial leaders that were entrusted to repress brigandage, right? They were definitely the successors of the comitatenses of the previous age. They were the mobile army. They were properly the dukes, right? Even here, those that within the same Ostrogothic people were at the head of the larger clans. They were settled on a provincial scale. They had their own consistent army and worked as such. So you see here there is a complete overlapping of the Roman and Germanic military administration. And it worked, right? The Ostrogoths expanded in Provence, triggering very much the Merovingians, by the way. They even managed to take back Sicily from the Vandals. They have all an important role in all of this. And as the emperors had been surrounded by the scholares, that is the Palatine schools, that is properly the armies of Pallas, the guards of Pallas, for security reasons. So Theodoric had his bodyguard. This was normal also, of course, in the Germanic context, but the institution was the same. Also, in terms of equipment, armament, there were several fabrici of the late empire, right, dispersed here, the statal armories, all filled with the Roman weaponry and equipment that continued to exist in Ostrogothic Italy and to produce armament, right? The Ostrogoths at this time, the only thing probably lacked, they didn't have enough cavalry as they had been able. The Ostrogoths, historically speaking, were possibly the most equestrian of the Germanic peoples to ever exist, because of the long permanence in the Ukraine, in these areas that were basically in the steppes, in the gates of the steppes, in contact with the nomadic peoples. They were used to fight on horseback a lot. We don't know after Hunnic times, because there was the Huns actually wiped out what we think was we call the Ostrogoths in the Ukraine. So after the Huns, we don't know what they do during the Hunnic times, but after Hunnic times, we know that they rebel and they reappear as a very changed people, and a much more mixed one, and disorderly one by certain standards, but still enough compact in the Danubian area. In Italy, they didn't have probably enough horses, like Italy, historically speaking, had also in Roman times. they had actually good horses, but they weren't many, right? So that's probably what they partially lacked, and especially at this point, for giving their previous attitudes, especially having several, a large mounted component. Also, we don't actually know. We know when we think about the Reitervölker, how much the Germanic peoples were properly fighting, quantitatively speaking, on horseback. There's an enormous debate, right? We mostly say that peoples like the Goths, the Longobards, so these all mostly from the eastern side of the store, were more equestrian in nature. And we definitely have that. We have horse archers in this area. In Italy, there were a lot of burials like that, for example. So we know that these people went on horseback, but they could be hunters, they could be something else. Of course, they fought at the same time. But we don't know how, like, the wall people, like, of course, that is one grave. We lack the quantitative data. Nobody knows how many actually fought on horseback. In my opinion, actually, I studied closely a bit the Longobards, and the evidence for a major mounted component is not there. Like, most of the Longobard people, especially the middle classes, that were pretty strong in that people at the time of the migration, were infantry, right? They had good cavalry, of course, for Germanic standards, but they like the proof that these were just so deeply influenced by nomadic warfare that they had so consequently to have such a high quota of cavalry is not supported actually by even, at least there is no way to calculate it practically. Also, it underestimates the fact that all of these peoples, of course, knew how to fight. Why wouldn't they know how to fight on horseback? Like, even the Franks or the Anglo-Saxons that are commonly thought to be, some of the ones that originally made the least use of mounted warfare, even the Scandinavians, actually, they did, right? They didn't have much of collective training, especially in this northwestern area, like in the eastern, with the steppes also open. In the east, they had gained much more experience. But, look at the sagas, even, representations of, in 7th century Sweden. We know that the ideal was of a free, theoretical Christian nobleman. It was a mounted warrior that was not on horseback just for the sake of representation, like the Longobards or the Visigoths by the 8th century had become, but traditionally still portrayed. No, we find evidence of that. Of course, it's we don't have, once again, this enormous evidence, but the few that there is shows it pretty clearly, right? So I don't mind personally, but there is. I say this because sometimes we overly emphasize the fact that these peoples were mixed. So we have to imagine, even just, even if, say, Sarmatian groups had gone so massively within the ranks of these populations, for which also there's no direct evidence of. That is to say, of course there were, but we don't know quantitatively how this was for real. Like, why would they necessarily have, for example, to be horsemen after just a few generations that had been assimilated? Like, why couldn't they be something else? Of course, even the Hunnic experience was very important, right? The same Hunnic experience had even in, under this peoples that Germanic peoples that stayed under the Huns rather than under the Romans during the contrast between the two, had acquired certain zootechnic equestrian capacities, but once again, at a structural level, we don't know, right? They were influenced politically, socially. Let's say a Theodoric was much more Hunnic-minded than Clovis, right? In many ways, but even in properly in the idea of power, right? These people were thinking much more semi-nomadically, right? Say much more closely to the nomadic mode that they would, than an Anglo-Saxon would. But also, we don't know by which margin. The Goths had the navies, the navy in Italy, right? And there's all that passage of Procopius about the incapacities. If you look at the Battle of Semnigallia, for example, or the siege of Rome, or the Byzantines were mocking the Goths because it was the stereotype. It was objectively true by certain standards that the Germans weren't very well versed in technology, right? They had difficulties they weren't used to operate sophisticated engines like siege warfare, siege towers, ships, and objectively they performed poorly as far as we understand, but we don't have to think it's necessarily because of a mechanic reason, right? It was possibly because they weren't fully, it's not that you inherit a system like it could be this Italy after Odoacer, and the army is magically there. As we've seen, there wasn't. They actually fought against Odoacers when they defeated it and they settled themselves. And if nobody had gotten them used to what existed before up to a certain level, that's what a broader organizational shortcoming would bring to, rather than because they couldn't operate a ship, right? Which is not credible because the Goths operated, ships, in the Ukraine, launching raids all over the Aegean Sea. Of course, they were smaller than the average Roman ships, but also Roman ships were getting smaller this time in turn. So, yeah, there was a difference even in here, but how different were they, really, from the Romans at the end of the day? In Ostrogothic Italy, there was still the practice of the donativum. There was this gift, una tantum, that was given by the emperor to the soldiers, to the sailors, to keep them happy. This in many ways reflects also towards the late antiquity, the increasing difficulty of giving a permanent pay to the army. So they mostly was just about looting these gifts every once in a while. Of course, it was a more regular pay as well, but it couldn't happen all the time, especially in these politically unstable ones. And in fact, however, during during wartime, troops received properly a salary, still in money. This is interesting in 6th century Italy at this point, sometimes at least, or in nature, right? That came under the traditional form of the annone, right, or the annona, singular. And so these people also didn't simply live on the base of the third of the land that, according to the hospitalitas, was given to them to maintain the army, as it was done also with the Goths, with Refrain and so on. Had become quite standard, right? The Goths had been settled, as we've seen also in previously. I mean, someone was surely overthrown from his land to settle a Goth, but generally speaking, they were also settled in areas that weren't very populated. And so this was a prize for the victory over Odoacer, right? But the point is that still the army had to work with a pay. Like, you can't properly think, okay, we have the land, so that would just maintain ourselves. This is a bit utopistic. Of course, you can't do much with the land. You can't survive with the land, but you can't have a professional army just with the land. You have to pay, right? And means that you have to extend, of course, the let's say the land of which these people live off, which is done via taxation, right, of other land. It is also possible that some laws of the Roman military code remained in force under Theodoric. In fact, also the prohibition for the Romans to bear arms can be considered in Ostrogothic times not as a measure of security destined to protect the German minority against every attempt of revolt, but actually as a continuation of the previous Roman legislation. Right? It was normal at that point for society to be demilitarized. The senators would hold most of the land, most of the power. They surely had their own clientele, could get armed, but the majority of the population as a whole was disarmed. As we've seen, the Goths had been sent there as properly Roman army, right, or as federati that, however, worked in function of, as the Roman army on those lands. This is pretty much it. So Actually, about Ostrogothic Italy, there would be a lot of things more to say. I think we made just one video that was one of the first ones, kind of sucked. We never made anything. We talked about it here and there, but there is always more to say, just as about Merovingian, Francia, and all the others, Romano-Germanic kingdoms. So for now, we can stop it here, really, because the essentials here that I wanted to present to you is, first of all, the kind of the more northern European model, where everything, the Roman presence fundamentally vanishes, right? It simply disappears, and it had never been so radically, structured in certain areas. From the other side, in southern Europe, the great continuity, even under Germanic rule, of essentially the same Roman political and military apparatus. Right? The first thing Theodoric does after he conquers Ravenna goes to Rome to render homage to the Pope and the Roman Senate. Right? This is the first step. So just to make you understand, it's not that Theodoric was a weak ruler. He was one of the great, most powerful rulers at that time. Why do you think he did that? Because of course he needed to support these people as well, to be that powerful and to be successful in that sense. So there are a lot of contradictions in the period. Also, the very late Theodorician era was troubled by the sense of distrust that the Roman elite wanted to call back the Byzantines. As far the rest of the people actually was fine with it, because finally there was stability, there was solid power. There were, the peninsula was at the center of this broader international relations that went across all the West. A lot of marriages, of alliances, and so on. So, anyhow, we'll see all this another time. But for now, I like to stress this contrast in a way. So for now, we stop it here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.